About 15 miles southwest of Boston, in a corner of Massachusetts that most of the country has never heard of, there is a town called Dover. It isn't the kind of town that announces itself, no strip malls on the way in, no chain restaurants. The roads are narrow and winding and follow the curve of the land rather than the grid of a city. And the houses, where there are houses, sit well back from the road behind long gravel drives and rows of old trees. The land is shaped by water. The Charles River coils through the western edge of town, slow and dark and older than any map. Smaller bodies of water sit quietly in the interior, Channing Pond, and the thin brooks that run down through the gullies, and the wetlands where the mist pools in the early hours of the morning. And there are the walls. New England is full of them. Low, crumbling stone walls, hip-high or chest-high, running along the edges of roads and cutting through the woods in lines that don't make sense anymore. They were built by colonial farmers who had to put the stones somewhere as they cleared the fields, and most of them have been standing exactly where they are, longer than the United States has been a country. Some are tidy and maintained, most are not. They are softened with moss, tumbled at the corners, patient, half sunk into the ground. A stone wall in New England is one of the quietest things on the continent. It sits, it waits. On the night of April the 21st, 1977, a 17-year-old boy driving home on Farm Street saw something perched on top of one of these walls. He was not alone in the car. His two friends were caught up in their own conversation and didn't look up in time, but the headlights swept over the stones, and in the space of a few seconds he saw very clearly something he could not explain. What he saw would be seen twice more within the next 26 hours, on 2 different roads by 3 different witnesses in 3 independent encounters. 2 of them would sit down and draw the creature from memory before they ever spoke to one another, and the 2 drawings would match. And then it would be gone. No second wave, no photographs, no bones, no trace. The town was called Dover. The creature came to be called the Dover Demon. And it is, today, one of the most closely documented and most quietly unsettling humanoid cryptid sightings in American history. The town of Dover, in the spring of 1977, was not expecting to become famous. It was, and still is, a quiet, affluent residential community. The kind of town where the loudest event of the week might be a PTA meeting or a snapped axle on a back road. It had never had a flap of paranormal activity. It had no local cryptid. It had no ghost story worth selling to a tourist. It had stone walls and woods and quiet. What it had, on the night of April the 21st, was a 17-year-old named William Bartlett. Everyone called him Bill. Bill was a thoughtful kid. He painted, he drew. He had the kind of eye that artists develop almost before they know they're developing it, where the shapes of the world arrange themselves into edges and volumes and light. That detail matters, keep it in mind. It was a Thursday, the last week of April school vacation. Spring had barely arrived. The damp, brittle New England April where the trees haven't leafed out yet, and the ground still smells faintly of wet bark, and the last of the winter. Bill was in the car with 2 friends, Mike Mazzocco and Andy Brody. They were just driving. There was no agenda. At about 10:30 in the evening, Bill was heading south on Farm Street near the intersection with Bridge Street. Farm Street is exactly what it sounds like. Narrow, winding, lined in places with those old tumbled walls. Not much light. A few houses set well back behind the trees, their windows glowing warm and distant. Bill's headlights swung across a broken section of wall on the left side of the road, and he saw something on top of it. For a heartbeat, he thought it was a dog. It was not a dog. The creature was perched on top of the stone wall. It was roughly 3.5 to 4 feet tall, about the height of a large child, though no child ever looked like this. It stood on 2 legs. The limbs were long and thin, too long in proportion to the body. The skin was hairless, peach-coloured or tan or a kind of pale rose, hard to read exactly in the headlights, but bare, no fur, no feathers. And the texture was wrong. Bartlett would later compare it to wet sandpaper, to shark skin. Something faintly rough, faintly granular, catching the light unevenly. The head was the first thing the eye went to. It was enormous, out of all proportion to the body. Bartlett described it as watermelon-shaped or egg-shaped, set on the thin neck of a thin frame. There were no ears, no nose, no mouth, or if there was a mouth, it wasn't visible. The face was almost entirely taken up by eyes. 2 of them, large, round, lidless, and glowing. Bartlett said the eyes looked like glass marbles lit from within. The colour of them was a brilliant, unmistakable orange. The creature's long fingers were wrapped around the stones of the wall, not resting, gripping. Bartlett used the word tendril, like the fingers were closing around the rocks the way the tendrils of a climbing plant close around a trellis. Deliberate, secure, adapted for holding on. The whole encounter lasted perhaps 3 or 4 seconds. The car kept moving, the creature was behind them. Bill didn't say anything at first. The other 2 boys were still mid-conversation. He drove them home, then he drove himself home. By the time he walked into his parents' house, he was visibly shaken. His father asked him what was wrong. Bill said, "I saw something. I don't know what I saw." Then he sat down at the kitchen table with a pencil and a piece of paper and, still rattled before he had spoken to anyone else, before anyone could plant a suggestion in his head, he drew it. That drawing exists. It has been reproduced hundreds of times since. It is one of the most recognizable pieces of evidence in American cryptozoology. And Bill Bartlett would later swear in the phrase that has followed him around for the rest of his life, that he would swear on a stack of Bibles that the drawing was accurate. It was just past 10:30 in the evening on April the 21st. The night was not over. Roughly 2 hours later, at about 12:30 in the morning, so now we are into April the 22nd, a 15-year-old boy named John Baxter was walking home. Miller Hill Road, which runs inside the same 2-mile corridor as Farm Street, is the kind of road you walked at 12:30 in the morning in 1977 if you were 15 and coming back from your girlfriend's house in a small town. No streetlights for the most part, no cars, the kind of dark where you can see more stars than you expect to, and the woods don't make much sound yet, and your own footsteps become the loudest thing in the world. John had walked about a quarter of a mile from his girlfriend's house, heading toward the Farm Street end of Miller Hill, when he saw a figure on the road ahead of him, walking toward him. Short, small. At first he assumed it was a neighbour. There was a man in the area, as he recalled later, who walked with a slight hunch, and John's first read was that it was him, out for some reason in the small hours. He kept walking. The figure kept walking, and then, as they closed the distance, something about the silhouette started to feel wrong. Baxter couldn't say later exactly what had triggered it. The gait, maybe. The angles of the body. Whatever it was, something in his deeper animal brain started to object to the idea that the thing in front of him was a man. When the creature noticed him, and we have to use a word like noticed here because we are describing a being whose interior life we do not and cannot know, it turned off the road, down into a wooded gully to the side. Not running, not panicked, but decisively, like something that preferred not to be watched. John, for reasons he has probably spent the last 50 years trying to explain to himself, followed. He stepped down off the road and into the gully. There was a small brook running at the bottom of it, trees on either side, bare and damp and black against the paler dark of the sky. And across the brook, about 15 feet from him, was the figure. It was braced against a tree. Its feet were curled over the top of a rock at the base of the trunk, moulded, not standing. The long fingers were wrapped around the bark of the tree, and the head was silhouetted against the faint sky. Baxter said the head looked like a figure 8, 2 bulges, a cranium, and a lower face pinched in the middle. Thin body. He couldn't make out the colour of the skin in the dark, but he could see the eyes, the same 2 large, round, shining eyes fixed on him. The moment went on longer than he wanted it to. Then Baxter did the sensible thing his deeper animal brain had been trying to make him do for a while. He got out of the gully. He climbed back up onto the road. He walked faster. A car eventually came along, a neighbour, someone he knew, and took him the rest of the way home. He didn't sleep much that night. Independently, without having spoken to Bill Bartlett, John Baxter would later sit down and draw what he had seen. And when those 2 sketches were eventually laid side by side, they matched. The same oversized featureless head, the same thin limbs, the same long gripping fingers, the same unsettling absence of a face as we know a face. 2 witnesses to the same humanoid cryptid describing it separately, drawing it separately from 2 different angles under 2 different lighting conditions. 2 witnesses, 2 roads, 2 hours apart, drawn separately, and it still wasn't over. The 3rd sighting came the following night, April the 22nd, around midnight. A 15-year-old girl named Abby Brabham was being driven home by her 18-year-old boyfriend, Will Tainter, along Springdale Avenue, still inside the same 2-mile corridor as the first 2 sightings, late enough that the roads were empty, early enough that they weren't expecting anything. Abby was in the passenger seat. They were approaching a small bridge on Springdale. The headlights picked out the usual things: the edge of the pavement, the grass shoulder, the dark wall of trees beyond. And then, at the side of the road near the bridge, they picked out something else. A creature, crouched or sitting on the verge. Tan, hairless, thin-limbed, large-headed. Abby saw it first and saw it more clearly because it was on her side of the car. Her description, given later to investigators, lined up with Bartlett and Baxter point for point. The watermelon head, the spindly limbs, the hairless skin. The size of it, she and Will agreed, was comparable to a large goat. There was one detail Abby gave that the other 2 had not. When she described the eyes, she did not say orange. She said green. Bright green. When investigators pushed on this, and they pushed because inconsistencies are where you test a story, Abby did not move. That was her memory. She allowed that the green could, in theory, have been a reflection of the headlights, but she didn't actually believe that. It had looked to her, she said, like the eyes were lit from the inside. Will Tainter only glimpsed it. He was watching the road, but he confirmed the size and the shape. Goat-sized. Wrong. Then they passed. The car kept moving. By the time they looked back, whatever it was gone. That was the 3rd and last of the primary sightings. 3 encounters, 3 different locations, 2 nights, 26 hours roughly, from the first sighting to the last. 6 witnesses in total, of whom 3 had a clear look: Bartlett, Baxter, and Brabham. 3 separate, independent drawings of essentially the same figure. Something walked through Dover, Massachusetts in the spring of 1977. It was seen and drawn and described, and then it was not seen again. The story could easily have ended there. Plenty of cryptid sightings end exactly there. As a small-town rumor, the kind of thing parents tell the kids not to repeat. The kind of thing that fades out in a year when everybody moves on. Dover's story didn't fade, and the reason it didn't fade has a name: Loren Coleman. Loren Coleman is one of the most well-known cryptozoologists in the United States. Cryptozoology, if the word is unfamiliar, is the study of animals whose existence has not been formally recognized by science. Folkloric creatures, alleged creatures, creatures that keep slipping sideways out of the zoological record. It is a field that attracts cranks. It is also occasionally a field that attracts careful researchers, and Coleman has always tried very hard to be in the second camp. His day job training was as a social worker, which gave him something not every paranormal investigator has: an ear for interviews, a sense of the difference between a rehearsed story and a remembered one. In the spring of 1977, Coleman happened to be living in the region. Word of the Dover sightings reached him fast. He recognized almost immediately that this was something unusual. A tight window, multiple witnesses, independent drawings, and a town with no prior history of paranormal activity to prime the imagination. He moved quickly. He assembled a team. In paranormal circles, the 4 people who ran the first Dover Demon investigation are sometimes called the 4 Horsemen. Loren Coleman himself, Walter Webb, the assistant director of the Hayden Planetarium at Boston's Science Museum, and a respected ufologist. Ed Fogg and Joseph Nyman, 2 veteran UFO researchers from eastern Massachusetts who had, between them, interviewed a very large number of people about very strange things. It's worth sitting with one detail there. Coleman brought in ufologists. That wasn't because he believed the Dover creature was an alien. It was because UFO researchers were the people in his world who had the most practical experience interviewing witnesses to high strangeness events, close encounter cases, abduction cases, humanoid sightings. They knew how to interview without leading. They knew what follow-up questions exposed hoaxes. They knew what genuine psychological aftermath looked like, and what performance looked like, and the difference. The team spoke to Bartlett, they spoke to Baxter, they spoke to Brabham and Taintor, and for completeness, they spoke to Mazzocco and Brody, the 2 friends in the car on Farm Street who hadn't seen the creature but had been there for the aftermath. They spoke to the parents, they spoke to the local police. They came away convinced that these were honest witnesses describing something they believed they had seen. That is not the same as saying the team was convinced the creature was real. And that distinction matters. Coleman and the others weren't issuing a verdict on the creature. They were issuing a verdict on the witnesses. And the verdict was that the teenagers were credible, the inconsistencies were the small, honest kind that real memory produces, the orange eyes and the green eyes, and the accounts did not carry the structural signatures of a coordinated prank. The strongest single piece of evidence, in most investigators' view, was the sketches. Bartlett and Baxter had drawn their creatures independently, without coordination, barely even having spoken about the experience. When the two drawings were compared, the alignment was striking. Same outsized, featureless head, same absent nose, absent ears, absent mouth, same long, thin, gripping limbs, same general proportions, same basic posture. Two people on two different roads in two different lighting conditions at two different times of night, drawing the same unusual animal from memory. The Dover police, for their part, had settled on a simpler explanation. They called it a school vacation hoax. The last week of April was a school break. The theory, more or less, was that bored teenagers had cooked up a story and run with it. The theory doesn't survive much scrutiny. Hoaxes have structure, hoaxes have coordination, hoaxes have payoff, someone eventually laughs and tells the truth. None of that ever happened. Bill Bartlett, in particular, has spent the rest of his adult life wishing the story would go away. He has declined the great majority of interviews. He has said, repeatedly, that the whole experience is embarrassing to keep reliving, that he is tired of being the teenager who saw the thing on the wall. He grew up to be a working fine art painter. People who run hoaxes talk. Eventually, someone talks. 50 years on, no one has. So if it wasn't a hoax, what was it? There have been broadly 4 serious theories proposed to explain the Dover demon. None of them is complete, which is part of why the case has had such a long life in cryptozoology. The first is the moose calf. This is one of the most frequently cited skeptical explanations, proposed most notably by the researcher Martin Kottmeyer. The idea is that Bartlett and the other witnesses misidentified a juvenile moose. Moose have oddly oblong heads. Their legs are long and spindly. In poor light, at a distance, under the pressure of a few seconds of attention, maybe the peach skin was wet hide, maybe the long fingers were a misread of slender legs, maybe the whole impossible thing resolves into a perfectly ordinary animal. It's a clean theory, and it has obvious appeal. And it doesn't work. In 1977, there were no resident moose populations in eastern Massachusetts. Moose have since moved back into parts of the state, mostly in the west, but in the late 70s, they were essentially absent from the area around Dover. A moose calf in Dover in April would itself have been an extraordinary sighting. There is also a biology problem. Moose calves are almost always born in late May or early June. An April sighting would require either a yearling, which would be much larger than the creature described, and which frankly looks like a moose, or a newborn, which would be significantly smaller and less capable of moving with the confidence Baxter described. And then there is the anatomy. Moose have prominent ears and a very heavy, very visible muzzle. The witnesses were specific: no ears, no muzzle, no visible nose. Moose have hooves. The Dover creature was described by every witness as having long gripping fingers, the kind of fingers that close around stones and around the trunk of a tree. No member of the deer family has hands. The moose calf accounts for height. It does not account for anatomy or range or timing or behavior. The second theory is the snowy owl. This one is most closely associated with the skeptic Joe Nickel. The proposal is that the witnesses saw a snowy owl, a large, pale, almost entirely white owl, and that partially opened wings read in the headlights as spindly arms. The peach or tan color was the headlights reflecting off white plumage. The large glowing eyes corresponded to the snowy owl's naturally enormous forward-facing eyes, which are, it has to be said, some of the most striking eyes in the animal world. Parts of this theory land. Snowy owl eyes are genuinely huge and reflective. A pale bird in headlights can throw a strange color. But the snowy owl has its own problems. A very large snowy owl stands about 2 feet tall. The Dover creature was 4 feet. You can fudge a lot under poor lighting. You cannot double a bird in a field sketch. The posture is wrong too. Snowy owls, when startled, do not climb stone walls on all fours. They do not grip tree trunks with hands. They fly. They flush, they do not walk, and Baxter's creature in particular was described as clearly bipedal, upright, thin, gripping rock with molded feet and bark with long fingers. That isn't owl behavior, that isn't really any bird's behavior. The snowy owl accounts for some of the visual impression, it does not account for the structure. The third answer comes not from biology, but from folklore. And it's the most atmospheric of the four, so give it a moment. In the oral traditions of the Cree people, and in the traditions of other Algonquian-speaking peoples of what is now Canada, there are stories of a kind of little people called, in one transliteration, the Managishi, sometimes rendered Memegwesi or Memegawensi, with variants depending on the nation and the region. They live among rocks, especially along rocky riverbanks and rapids. They are tricksters, known for upending canoes, for moving things, for the small mischiefs you cannot quite catch in the act. Their physical description, as recorded in the traditions, is worth listening to carefully. Small, hairless, heads disproportionately large, thin limbs, large eyes, often no visible nose or only a very flat one, associated constantly with rocks and with water. The Dover creature was seen on 3 occasions, once perched on a tumbled stone wall, once in a gully next to a brook braced against a tree, once near a bridge, which is to say, near water, hairless, large-headed, thin-limbed, large-eyed, no nose, and it is not a perfect match, no folkloric description ever is. But the resonance is there. The cryptozoologist Carl Schuker is one of several researchers who have suggested in print that the Managishi and the Dover demon may be the same being, that what the witnesses encountered may not be an unknown animal at all, in the deep sense, but the reappearance of something Native American folklore had been quietly describing for a very long time. That a map of Dover in April of 1977, its stone walls, its brooks, its bridges, might be a kind of habitat, one that something older than the town might still occasionally walk through. And the folkloric thread runs deeper than Cree country. Massachusetts has its own little people tradition. In Wampanoag folklore, the folklore of the people who were on this land long before the town of Dover existed, there are stories of the Pukwudgie, small humanoid beings, sometimes mischievous, sometimes malevolent, associated with specific wooded places. The Bridgewater Triangle, a 200 square mile area in southeastern Massachusetts with its own long history of paranormal activity and cryptid sightings, still draws reports of Pukwudgies today. The Pukwudgie is not the same creature as the Dover demon, and no serious researcher has argued that it is. But it is worth knowing that Massachusetts native folklore has, for centuries, described small humanoid figures in the woods, and that the country's memory of such beings runs longer than the highway system that now crosses it. This is speculative territory, of course. The Cree and other Algonquian nations are not the same people as those who historically lived in the territory that is now Massachusetts. The Massachusetts, the Wampanoag, the Nipmuc. Though the broader Algonquian language family stretches across much of eastern North America, and folklore motifs travel with language families in ways that sometimes outlast borders. But the resonance is there. The fourth explanation is the extraterrestrial one. It is almost impossible in 1977 to describe a small, hairless, bipedal creature with a large head and enormous eyes, and not immediately conjure, in a modern listener's mind, the figure of the so-called Grey. The stereotyped alien of abduction lore, the image that had begun to crystallize through books like The Interrupted Journey, the 1966 account of the Barney and Betty Hill abduction case, and later through films like Close Encounters of the Third Kind, which came out in November of 1977, about 7 months after the Dover sightings. The timeline is important. The cultural wave that made Greys a familiar silhouette was breaking by 1977, but it had not fully landed. Bartlett, Baxter and Brabham drew their creatures before that particular archetype was standardized in popular imagination. Even so, the resemblance is real in the proportions: large head, thin body, large eyes. In the close encounter and abduction literature of the period, Greys are described again and again in terms a listener will recognize: small humanoid, disproportionately large cranium, enormous dark eyes, thin limbs. The Dover demon fits that silhouette closely enough that the comparison was being made within days of the first sighting. The Dover creature has tan or peach skin, rather than the classic grey. The Dover creature has long gripping fingers, which Greys are not typically described as having. The Dover creature's behaviour, perching on walls, climbing through brush, moving through the geography, is not the standard abduction narrative. But the silhouette has encouraged a lot of speculation, and there is one more detail that speculation has latched onto. One day before the first Dover sighting on April the 20th, 1977, a UFO was reported in the neighbouring town of Medfield. Medfield sits right next to Dover. No UFO was reported during the Dover encounters themselves, but the timing has been irresistible to those inclined to connect dots. A craft over Medfield on Wednesday, a strange creature in Dover on Thursday night, and again Friday night. Some have speculated that whatever was over Medfield had somehow deposited something, a biological survey entity, a lost specimen, a passenger. There is no physical link, no photograph, no confirmed sighting tying the two reports directly together. But the proximity in time and space has entered the lore of the case, and it is the reason the Dover demon sits in ufological circles on the same shelf as the Flatwoods monster, a 1952 West Virginia humanoid cryptid case that likewise came with a UFO sighting the same night, and the Kelly Hopkinsville encounter of 1955, the Kentucky case of small humanoid beings with oversized heads and glowing eyes that besieged a farmhouse through the night. Brief, localized, humanoid, and in all three cases, one strange night that nobody has fully explained in the 70, 50, and roughly 50 years that have followed. 4 theories, none of them complete. The moose calf fails on anatomy and on range, the snowy owl fails on size and posture. The Managishi and the Wampanoag Pukwadgi alongside it is a cultural resonance rather than a concrete identification. The grey is a silhouette overlay, not an explanation. What is left is the original strange fact. In April of 1977, 3 young people on 3 different roads in a quiet Massachusetts town saw something that did not fit anything in the local biology. 2 of them, without speaking to each other, drew it, and the drawings matched. The witnesses were consistent. The investigation was careful. And no follow-up sighting in the days, weeks, or months afterward produced the creature again. The window opened. The window closed. What was inside the window, we do not know. There is context on either side of the 1977 wave, though, and it's worth pausing on before the story closes. There is a prior sighting from 1972, 5 years earlier. A young man named Mark Sennett and some friends reported seeing a small, strange figure at Channing Pond, one of the interior bodies of water in Dover mentioned at the beginning. They told the police at the time, it didn't go anywhere in 1972. Nobody knew what to do with it. It sat the way odd reports sit in small-town filing cabinets until after the main flap of Dover demon sightings, when someone thought to look it up again. The Dover Historical Society has also noted whispers from about 5 years before the main sightings in the neighbouring town of Sherborne, reports of something matching the same description. These never made it into any formal investigation. Bill Bartlett himself had a second, less definite experience in 1978, roughly a year after the original sighting. He was parked in a car with his girlfriend when they heard a heavy thump on the vehicle, the kind of solid impact that makes you bolt upright. And looking out, Bartlett saw a blur of something moving away. He could not, in honesty, say that it was the same creature. The light was bad. His own nerves were already alert after everything, but he would say that the movement, the speed, the feel of the thing reminded him of Farm Street. That detail he has kept consistent for decades. Occasional anecdotal cryptid reports have come in since, though none with the intensity of the original wave. In the year 2000, a fisherman at the Cobble Mountain Reservoir, about 80 miles from Dover, deep in the western part of Massachusetts, in a different ecological region, reported a humanoid figure with large shining eyes near the waterline. A single witness. A brief sighting. The geographic distance makes any direct connection to Dover very thin, but the shape of the report is familiar. Within Dover itself, occasionally, someone will report an uneasy feeling at the edge of a piece of conservation land, a movement at the periphery of vision, a shape that the eye wants to resolve into something and can't. Residents don't generally make much of these. They belong more to atmosphere than to documented cryptozoology. But they are the kind of small, low-voltage haunting that a legend leaves behind. Long after the legend itself has ended, a town remembers even when it isn't trying to. Bill Bartlett grew up to be a working, fine art painter. He is, by most accounts, a private and thoughtful man. He has given a handful of interviews over the decades, reluctantly, and he has often said that the whole experience is something he wishes he could set down. He has never, across 50 years, substantially changed his story. The shape of it, the wall, the fingers, the eyes, the head, has been exactly the same in 1977, in 1987, in 1997, and in interviews long after. That kind of quiet consistency across a lifetime is one of the harder things in human testimony to fake. John Baxter went on to live his life, Abby Brabham the same. They did not become professional witnesses, they did not write books. The episode has been, for each of them, a small, strange, private thing. The town itself has, over the years, come to a kind of fond peace with its demon. The Dover Historical Society's Samhain Museum has a local exhibit about the creature. A certain gentle local humour has grown up around it, not mocking the witnesses, but claiming the legend as part of the town's identity. For a small, quiet, overlooked place, the Dover demon is the thing that outsiders actually know Dover for. There is one more detail worth sitting with, because it matters more than it looks like it matters. The Dover demon is what some researchers call a boutique cryptid. Unlike Bigfoot, which is reported across essentially every forested region of North America, or the Loch Ness Monster, which has a generations-long sighting record, or Mothman, whose Point Pleasant flap ran for more than a year, the Dover demon is tied to one specific place and one specific 2-day period. That is statistically unusual. Famous paranormal cases almost always generate copycat sightings. Once a story is in the news, suggestible people start seeing things, or misremembering things, and the case file bloats. The Dover case didn't do that. No wave of sightings in 1978, none in 1979, none in the 80s. A handful of scattered echoes across the decades, most of them too thin to build anything on, and otherwise, silence. That absence is its own quiet kind of evidence, not proof of anything exactly. But evidence that whatever happened in those 26 hours was not a wave. It was a window. The Dover demon was seen 3 times by 3 witnesses on 3 roads over 26 hours in the spring of 1977. It was sketched independently by 2 of those witnesses, and the sketches matched. It was investigated within days by 4 of the most capable cryptozoology and paranormal researchers in eastern Massachusetts. It was described consistently in the immediate aftermath, and it has been described consistently by the same people 50 years later, with no one breaking and no one cashing in and no one laughing. Its physical characteristics do not match any known animal native to Massachusetts, or for the most part, any known animal anywhere. Was it a moose calf, improbably far south of its range, improbably early in the year, improbably handed? A snowy owl at twice its normal size, climbing a stone wall on fingers it does not have? A Managishi out of Cree folklore, or a Pukwoodgi out of Wampanoag folklore walking a corridor older than the town around it? A small quiet passenger from a craft that had been over the next town the night before? A close encounter perhaps, with no abduction and no aftermath, only a 4-foot figure in a pair of headlights and then the road continuing? Or something else, something the language of cryptozoology has not yet managed to name? We don't know, we almost certainly will not know. The Dover demon remains one of the most carefully documented and most stubbornly unresolved humanoid cryptid cases in American history, a true unsolved mystery in a country that has had plenty to choose from. The stone walls of Farm Street are still there, the woods still close in on the road, the houses still sit back behind the trees, their lights soft and distant. The Charles River still runs slow and dark through the western edge of town. Channing Pond is still there, the bridges on Springdale are still there, Miller Hill Road is still there, still narrow, still walkable, if you are the kind of person who walks through small New England towns in the small hours, which is a smaller group of people every year. And whatever it was that Bill Bartlett's headlights caught for 3 seconds on the night of April the 21st, 1977, whatever it was that John Baxter followed into the gully, and that Abby Brabham saw sitting at the edge of Springdale Avenue the following night, went on about whatever its business was, and did not come back. 26 hours, 3 witnesses, 3 sketches, one small Massachusetts town that remembers. The stone walls are doing what stone walls have always done. They sit, they wait.